On the morning of February 11th, 1934, a thick blanket of fog covered the Northeast from Maine to Virginia. Visibility was measured in inches. Everything was grounded. But at a small rural airport in upstate New York, 25-year-old Ed Link prepared his Cessna for takeoff. Deeply in debt and struggling to keep his fledgling flight school alive, Link knew that everything he had depended on this flight. What Link would accomplish that day in the skies above New York would propel him into a life of invention and discovery.
Ed Link was an original. There was not anyone like him around before or since.
Ed Link was a true American genius. He dreamed the big dreams and then he made them happen.
Your first impression would be that he was an ordinary man, but he was a pretty incredible genius. He was a modest man, but able to make connections in his mind that most of us just can't make. He was a remarkable person.
Aviator, inventor, industrialist, deep-sea diver. Ed Link did it all. A high school dropout at 17, he would make himself a millionaire before he was 40.
It's hard to explain how important Ed Link was to the world of inventions and the world of science. He was, simply speaking, probably the most prolific inventor we had of the 20th century. He advanced in leaps and bounds how we first explored the sky and then how we explored the sea.
Because of Ed Link, we were able to do things that we couldn't do before. The human family no longer thinks of the ocean as it used to before Ed Link.
One thing I try to do is dream something that will be useful, and then you gradually work at it and you get a conception, and if you're practical about it, then you can make it come true.
Edwin Albert Link was born on July 26, 1904, in Huntington, Indiana. When he was 6, his father moved the family to Binghamton, a sprawling industrial giant in upstate New York, proudly living up to its reputation as the Valley of Opportunity.
People in Binghamton made things with their hands: cigars, furniture, glass bottles, patent medicine, hundreds of products. And many of the people working in these factories were immigrants coming from Eastern Europe. Thousands and thousands came here, and many of those immigrants were artisans.
The Link family made player pianos. Ed Link Sr. was a clever and dashing businessman who in a short time turned around a bankrupt piano factory and placed it at the top of the industry. Link pianos and organs were soon found in theaters and speakeasies across the Northeast. And Ed Sr. was enjoying the perks of success. A member of the elite Binghamton Club, Link was golf and billiard champion and a community leader. He was blazing a trail he hoped his 2 young boys would follow. But Edwin Jr. showed no signs of following in his father's footsteps. Ed was a quiet but curious little boy who hiked the banks of the Susquehanna River daily and tinkered in the family garage. Even early on, he showed a passion for building things to solve problems. When he wanted to cross the river, he built a crude raft out of wooden pallets. In the winter, he nailed skis to it and converted it into an ice boat. When he worried that his house might catch fire and he'd be trapped on the second floor, he built an escape slide to the street below. One day, while experimenting with gunpowder, he blew the door off a neighbor's barn. Even Ed couldn't explain what problem he was trying to solve that day. But in school, he floundered, was bored, and had trouble paying attention. My grades, Ed told a reporter years later, were as low as you could get and still pass. Then, when he was 14, his parents divorced. Ed moved across the country with his mother.
He had a mother who was very different from the father. They were divorced. They could not have been too compatible because she was a much more adventurous person. She went out to California, which was a bold thing. A divorced woman moved to California on her own. So she had more the bold, adventurous personality.
Ed's mother enrolled him in the California Polytechnic Institute, where he amazed his instructors with his remarkable technical ability. He began earning money repairing motorcycles and hung around the local service station offering to help out. With the money he made, he soon had enough to pursue a growing passion. Flying had become a national obsession in the 1920s. Ed's unbridled imagination had been fueled even more by the stories of the flying aces of World War I.
It was new and exciting, and the barnstormers were around, and they were beneficiaries of some rather interesting lore that associated with them. So it was almost like a new frontier, and the people were excited about it.
One afternoon, he borrowed a friend's motorcycle and rode out to an airfield in Los Angeles. There, he was greeted by the airport's owner, Sidney Chaplin, Charlie Chaplin's older brother. There he stood, Link remembered, all duded up in riding pants and boots, a leather flying jacket, silk scarf with helmet and goggles. I sure was impressed. For the better part of an hour, we did loops and spins and buzzed everything in sight. Thank heavens I didn't get sick. But when they landed, Ed hadn't touched the controls. That's a hell of a way to learn how to fly, he thought. Despite his disappointment, his mind was made up. He would be a pilot. But when Ed's father learned of the flight, he was furious. He forbid me to take another lesson, Ed remembered. It would be 6 years before Link would fly again.
Ed Link, the elder, had rather old-fashioned ideas about flying. The pilots of the day were somewhat disreputable fellows, and it was not a proper thing for a businessman to go into. There wasn't money to be made in flying. It was clearly frivolous and dangerous and eccentric and expensive, and all this is from the point of view of your solid middle-class businessman in the 1920s. So this was not what the elder Ed Link wanted for his son.
In 1922, Ed and his mother returned to Binghamton, where Ed once again tried but failed in school. Finally, he dropped out for good. His father forced Ed to come to work at the piano factory. I started out at the bottom, he remembered. It wasn't what I had planned for a career, but it's curious how things work out. Ed's years at the piano factory would help mold his future.
Ed Link always felt a kinship more to the workers in his father's factory than he did to the office people. He felt a strong relationship to those people who, working with lathes every single day, would turn out finely crafted pianos and organs out of chunks of wood.
The craftsmen who worked in the factory helped sharpen Ed's innate creative abilities. He quickly became a master at building and tuning the massive theater organs with their miles of pipes and wires. Ed displayed a remarkable ability for forging the connection between his head and his hands. When he was just 19 years old, he received his first patent for a suction device he created to lift dust out of piano rolls. It was a simple little thing, Ed told a writer years later, designed to make my job easier. Ed had become the factory's most versatile employee, and his father was pleased. They thought I was going to make a nice organ builder, Ed remembered, but I had other plans.
Ed had made up his mind that flying was what he really wanted to do, so he went out and figured out a way on his own to learn to fly without support from his father. And it included hanging around at the airport and, carrying fuel for the pilots and helping them out, cleaning their planes, and once in a while they'd let him get behind the controls and taxi up and down. They called that the penguin system of learning to fly, because a penguin can't fly. You just taxi up and down, you begin to get a feel for the controls. Finally, he scraped together some money and took some more flying lessons from some of the local pilots, from Dick Bennett.
Ed idolized Dick Bennett, a local hero who in World War I shot down 5 German planes over France before being shot down himself. Bennett now owned his own airfield and made a living barnstorming across the Northeast. Bennett liked Ed and admired his enthusiasm. He gave Ed lessons and taught him how to be a barnstormer. Finally, in 1926, at the age of 22, Link received his pilot's license. It had taken 6 years and every spare cent he had. Ed borrowed money from his mother and bought a plane, a Cessna AA, the first ever built, and began to pursue his dream. He built pianos during the day and spent evenings and weekends sharpening his skills as an aviator. He quickly gained a reputation as a top-notch pilot and barnstormer.
He would tell stories about how they would go out and they buzz over a town at about 50 feet above the ground and buzz around and then land in a cow pasture. And everybody would come out and you could sell airplane rides because it was so exciting to people. They would come out and they would spend money when they didn't have it to spend on anything else.
To indicate how avid people were about flying, there was a rumor in town one afternoon that Lindbergh was going to fly over the city at about 3 p.m. in the afternoon on his way to Buffalo. This is a rumor, but people were so avid to know about flying that some of the schools stopped their session and let the children out in the street so they could see the airplane go over. Of course, nothing happened. That's how excited people were about flying in the 20s.
But Ed saw the airplane as more than just a device for amusement. He enjoyed the company of his fellow flyers, but did not share their love for danger. I wanted to promote flying, Ed told a reporter, not kill it.
Ed Link was not really a thrill seeker. He didn't quite fit the mold of the rakish pilot with the silk scarf around his neck. He was a guy who could see that the airplane was going to be practically useful. And he wanted to be one of the people who made the airplane useful.
At that time, people were learning to fly by the seat of their pants, so to speak, and there was no way for them to really understand the workings of a plane before they got in the air. And consequently, many people died or were killed in plane crashes. And so Ed thought about this a lot, and he thought there's no real reason why this has to be. There has to be a way to make a good workable trainer that would teach people something about planes, at least before they ever got off the ground.
Ed envisioned a tool that could simulate the feel and response of an airplane in flight. In a dark corner of the organ factory, Ed went to work.
Link wanted motion for his flight trainer. Well, how do you create motion? In the Link organ and the Link piano, you create motion using a vacuum system. So he developed a vacuum system that would create the motion for the trainers.
For more than a year, Ed worked on perfecting his flight trainer, using his brother Theron and others as test subjects. Finally, on April 14, 1929, Ed received a patent for his pilot maker. Link moved quickly and opened a flight school in the basement of the piano factory, using his trainer as the primary teacher. He guaranteed to teach anyone to fly for just $85. Within 2 months, 100 people had signed up. Link began building additional trainers with the intention to sell them to other flight schools across the country. But in October, the economy collapsed. Millions were out of work. Few people had money for flying lessons. Link concentrated on marketing his trainer, but with little success, except for park owners who used it as an amusement ride. Then in December 1930, the piano factory folded, leaving Link's flight school without a home. Ed moved the flight school to a small airfield on the outskirts of Binghamton. Barnstorming when he had to, giving lessons when he could, Link, like the rest of the country, struggled to survive. But as the Depression deepened, the school teetered on failure. By 1931, 2 years had passed since Ed had invented his pilot maker. He had focused almost entirely on flying and perfecting his trainer. But he also found time to fall in love. Marion Clayton was a spirited and energetic reporter for the Binghamton Press. Ed had met her the year before on a blind date, and she had written a story about him and his air-minded dog.
Ed Link was basically a shy guy, but I think when it came to Marion, he just couldn't resist her. She was beautiful. She was a charming young lady, and he just knew that she was the one for him.
Marion and Ed were just like a perfect fit. They were the right hand and the left hand of the person, you know. They complemented each other so well. It looked as if it was certainly something that was meant to be, that relationship. Their whole story is a love story from that time on, from the time that she first heard about him until they met, and all their lifetime.
Ed and Marion were married on June 6, 1931. They moved into Ed's mother's house on the banks of the Susquehanna River, where Ed had hiked as a boy. They would live in the same house for the rest of their lives. Marion left her job at the paper and took over managing Ed's flight school. Ed continued to update the pilot maker, adding an instrument panel and a hood so he could teach blind flying methods. But only a handful of pilot makers had been sold, mostly to amusement parks. Only 2 trainers had gone to the aviation industry. The trainer, which had showed such promise, Marion wrote in her diary, has sunk back into obscurity. One evening, Ed woke Marion in the middle of the night. He'd had a dream, he told his sleepy wife, of a device that would allow him to display lighted messages from his plane.
He rigged up a sign on the bottom wing of an airplane, there was his whole array of lights, and he could flash a message on there. Energetic shoes was one of them. Eat Spalding cakes, or Spalding cakes are fresh, or something like that. And again, using a piano roll type paper and vacuum system, he would make the different lights come on at various different times to create his message. So he would fly over a city, and people would look up because it was exciting you'd hear an airplane. You didn't hear that every day. So you hear an airplane, you look up, and there's this illuminated message flying across the sky: buy Spalding cakes and pies.
The Link Sky sign proved to be a moderate success. He slowly began to pull himself out of debt. He brought on additional pilots to help fly the Sky sign and trained them to fly at night using his trainer. But Ed remained frustrated by the lack of interest in his invention. He began to consider it a failure and toyed with the notion of shutting down. But a national crisis would soon change his life forever.
The airmail is going to begin all over again. Senate disclosure...
In February 1934, President Roosevelt, angered by the corruption of private carriers flying the airmail, canceled all contracts and gave the job of flying the mail to the Army.
Army bases are working day and night to condition observation and cargo planes for the tough job of flying the air mail. But the Army lads say they can do it while Uncle Sam is sorting things out for an airmail New Deal. The airmail goes back to the Army, which started it in May 1918.
But within the first week, 5 pilots were killed, 6 more were seriously injured. Within 2 weeks, more than a dozen pilots were dead. The country was outraged and the Army devastated.
So the contracts for flying the mail was very quickly given back to the private carriers, but the Army realized we need to figure out how to fly in bad weather. We need to be able to figure out how to get from point A to point B through the clouds when we can't see the ground.
On February 10th, Ed received an urgent message asking him to be in Newark the following morning to demonstrate his trainer to the Army. Overnight, fog had moved in and covered the Northeast. The New York Times called it blind man's weather. Shortly after dawn, Ed took off into the soup. Since he was a boy, he had dreamed of being a pilot. Now, alone in his airplane, guided only by his instruments and his instincts, Link flew on.
They were standing out on the runway, the military brass waiting for him, and they were just about to give up. They believed that he couldn't possibly fly in that kind of weather, so they had turned away and started to walk off when they heard this droning and humming, and they turned around and looked back, and here comes Dad flying like it was nothing, and landed that plane just as smoothly as could be on a completely dark and rainy runway.
And they were quite astonished because this was a remarkable demonstration of his ability, his personal ability to fly in instrument weather, to fly when he couldn't see anything. This is one of the things that Ed Link demonstrated with the trainer, that you have to have instruments. You can't tell which way is up when you're socked in completely. So he went then and demonstrated his trainer and immediately got a contract with the U.S. Army.
They finally gave me a little contract to train 10 of their pilots of the Link trainer and see how they did in the air. And they did so well, that just really started things rolling.
With the Army's order, the era of simulation had arrived. Requests for Link trainers flooded in. By 1936, hundreds of pilot makers were being shipped around the world, and the trainer continued to evolve. Ed added airspeed indicators and a compass to the instrument panel and a remote desk assembly for instructors. Alarmed by the growing unrest in Europe, the British Air Force ordered 50 Link trainers on the condition that they be built within the British Commonwealth. So Ed opened a plant in Ontario, Canada, north of the Thousand Islands. The quiet barnstormer from Binghamton was now an international industrialist. But Britain was not the only country interested in Ed's invention. That summer, he received an invitation from the Japanese government, asking if he would come to Japan and train their pilots on the Link trainer.
And he checked with the State Department because hostilities were building up at the time. He checked with the State Department and said, is it okay if I do this? And they said, yes, and tell us what you find when you get there.
On November 12, 1936, Ed and Marion sailed for the Far East. When they arrived, they were struck by the color and beauty of the Japanese landscape and by the hospitality of the people. Nothing they were allowed to see showed any indication of a country building for war. The next day, Ed was taken to the training field. What he saw stunned him, and he quickly realized the true intent of the Japanese invitation.
And there was his trainer all in pieces. And it was clear that the Japanese were trying to take it apart and reverse engineer and figure out how to build their own flight trainers. And when he saw that, he declined to fix it. They wanted him to show them how it would go back together, with the idea that then they would go and build their own.
Ed agreed to stay in Japan and train the pilots on the remaining trainers. The Links were fascinated by the singular nature of the Japanese culture and enjoyed their time touring the country. But they could not escape the feeling that dark clouds loomed on the horizon. Later, on the trip home through England, Marion wrote in her diary, "Everyone here expects war, and a great war is feared." June 1940. All of Europe is engulfed in war. The German Luftwaffe had begun terror bombing London. And in the skies over England, a tremendous battle raged for control of the air. The Battle of Britain would be the turning point of the air war in Europe. Vastly outnumbered, the Royal Air Force now relied heavily on Link's Blue Box to train their crews in record time.
Clearly, the ability to train large numbers of pilots quickly was critical to winning the war.
Air Marshal Robert Leckie, he was the head of the Royal Canadian Air Force. He said, "The Battle of Britain is being won on the training fields where there are Link trainers." In other words, the contribution that the trainers were making was recognized at the highest level.
Ed's small aviation company was now a giant wartime factory.
A lot of production. Trainer coming off the assembly line almost every 45 minutes.
At one point during the war, they were putting out a trainer in about 45 minutes. And if the little bell didn't ring every 45 minutes, Ed Link would be down on the floor wanting to know what was the holdup.
As thousands of blue boxes rolled off the assembly lines, Link continued to develop ideas to help win the war.
Ed was a absolutely prolific inventor. He never was resting. He's always wanting to try something out, do something different. He had a hydro trainer because we had a plant up in Gananoque, Ontario, and that's where the hydro trainer was made. And of course, in the navigational field, he had the sextant. Then he had a marvelous device in his office, and I've often wondered what happened to it. It was called the star globe, and it was a plastic globe that was translucent, but inside were various stars, and you could teach some navigation.
Night navigation, Link believed, was vitally important for pilots to master. He decided to publish a book of tips for RAF pilots to assist them in learning star patterns. Ed insisted on taking the pictures himself. But Link also designed what the Air Force called a marvel of American ingenuity and precision. The Celestial Navigational Trainer, or CNT, was designed to train long-range bomber crews. Standing more than 80 feet tall and equipped with nearly 400 lights to simulate star patterns, the CNT was one of the most innovative devices ever built. An entire crew of 6 men could train under its massive dome. Both the British and U.S. Air Force credited the CNT with cutting training time by more than 50% and with saving the lives of thousands of airmen. By 1945, Link Aviation had produced more than 10,000 blue boxes and had trained more than 500,000 pilots worldwide. And Ed Link had built an industry and a reputation as a fair and generous employer.
The other part of his genius was that the workers turning out these blue boxes were treated like family. And they truly loved Ed Link, and I think truly he loved them back as the workers and the craftsmen that they were.
He was very conscious of remembering the older employees who had been there with him when he was just getting started. And frequently, he'd get very emotional about it when he was speaking.
Your loyalty to me, Link told his employees, and to the company, has been one of the finest experiences of my life. By the end of the war, Link was exhausted. For 16 years, he had worked endlessly to build his company. He began spending time in the Canadian wilderness, hunting and fishing with Marion and his two young boys, William and Clayton. The industry he created had taught thousands of men and women to fly and helped win a world war. But Ed Link was a restless man and would soon seek a new frontier. He would find it in the deep waters of the world's oceans, where he would achieve his greatest triumphs and be forced to endure a tragedy that would darken the remaining days of his life.
And training and instrument flying got so advanced they could put it on a computer and solve their equations. I lost interest. I like things that you can't put on a computer. So that's been why I guess I moved from the air to the sea. As people have asked me, why would you go to the sea? Water is so different from there. And I said, no, it isn't. It's just alike. Only water is thicker.
By 1950, Link was ready to move on. Ed was 45 years old and wealthy beyond his imagination. He began to seek a new world of adventure. He bought a large sailboat, the Blue Heron, and with his wife Marion set sail for the blue waters of the South Atlantic. One evening, while preparing for a cruise to the Caribbean, a friend invited the Links to investigate a shipwreck near the Florida Keys. Ed jumped at the chance. I should have known then, Marion later wrote, that one of those critical times had arrived in Ed's life. Donned in an old steel diver's helmet, Ed ventured for the first time under the waves of the Florida Gulf. There, he discovered the coral-crusted remains of a 400-year-old Spanish cannon.
And Marion said they became treasure hunters overnight. They got a little taste of what it's like to go down there and find a cannon, and the next thing you know, Ed was fascinated with the deep sea. And she wasn't at first. She was afraid to dive and wasn't much of a swimmer. But it wasn't long before he had her underwater and learning to look for things too, and they just got really excited and caught up in it.
He bought an old shrimp boat and called her Sea Diver, and along with their two boys, Marion and Ed began crisscrossing the South Atlantic. They dove off Jamaica, the Bahamas, and the plantation keys of Florida. They pulled up teapots and coins, a 200-year-old bronze ship bell, and the oldest cannon ever found in the New World.
One day I was over at the house and Marion reached up in the den up on the top shelf of the bookcase and took a vase in her hands and brought it down and handed it to me and said, here, take this. And I was holding it and she said, that's 2,000 years old and it's from the Sea of Galilee. So I was like, oh.
We found ourselves, Marion wrote, unable to resist the tales of treasure-laden ships lying upon the ocean floor. We felt sure that they only awaited our coming to surrender their vast quantities of riches. But Ed and Marion did not see themselves as mere treasure hunters. It's impossible to discover these ancient artifacts without feeling a tantalizing curiosity of their origin, Marion wrote.
He and Marion both saw history as the real treasure under the sea.
In the summer of 1955, 51-year-old Ed Link, the aging navigator who had forged himself a new world in a flight through the foggy skies of New York, set out to relive the voyage of Columbus.
The conventional wisdom at the time was that Columbus's first landfall was on a little island called San Salvador, also known as Watling's Island. The links in following Columbus's charts became convinced that that San Salvador, in fact, was not the Columbus's initial landfall, that it was probably a small island in either in the Turks group or in the Caicos group.
Armed with a crate of maps and a copy of Columbus's journal, the Lynx set out. But Ed knew that mere theory alone would not prove anything. He wanted to find the remainders of the Santa Maria, which was lost on Christmas Eve, 1492. For weeks, the Lynx searched, but found nothing. Though certain that his theory was correct, Ed had grown frustrated and begun to consider moving on. Then, one afternoon, while snorkeling off a small island near Haiti, Marion spotted a shadowy object emerging from the sand and coral below her. It was an anchor, hand-forged from separate pieces of steel, the same type of craftsmanship used at the time of Columbus. Ed had his proof.
He was really a popular outfit for a while. People were following the ship around everywhere he went. The movie stars and top media people, and everybody was following this early underwater work.
Along the coast of Israel, fishermen often return with relics of the past in their nets. The stories of their finds brought to the Holy Land a most unusual American. Aviator, inventor, retired industrialist, and sea diver, all rolled into one. Edwin A. Link of Binghamton, New York, who shares with his wife Marion an enthusiasm for historical treasure hunts.
By 1962, Ed Link had quietly become the best-regarded underwater archaeologist in the world. Marion had published a book about sea divers' travels. They had explored the sunken remains of the city of Port Royal and had dived in the holy waters of Caesarea. He also now had a new boat, the Sea Diver II, which he designed entirely himself, from the keel up. It was the most technologically advanced oceanographic vessel in the world. But Ed Link's mind never stopped turning, and he had begun to develop a wider vision for the future of undersea exploration.
Ed had the kind of mind that was always seeing potential where nothing existed yet. He saw things that we're not doing yet that we're going to have to do under the oceans, and he realized that they're going to have the equipment and the way to survive the same as, in fact, he thought it was more important to do underwater research than it was even to go to space. So he began to invent equipment that could keep you down underwater longer periods of time.
In 1961, in cooperation with the National Geographic Society, Ed began work on a program he called Man in Sea. "My ultimate aim is to put divers on the floor of the ocean," Ed wrote, "and to live and work there at depths up to 1,000 feet for days, weeks, even months. If we can do this," he added, "we will have available the resources of an area the size of the continent of Africa." And Link had created a device to allow man to do just that.
Ed was a guy with his eyes on the horizon all the time. He knew the interior of the sea, and he knew the dangers of decompression. And what he wanted to do was to minimize that risk, not only just for himself, but for all those humans who were actually going to go deep and spend time working in the sea. So that was the origin of the submersible decompression chamber, a kind of underwater elevator that allowed people to climb on board on a ship, go down to the depth where they'd be working, let's say 200, 300, 400 feet, do the work, and come back and then be controlled in the decompression.
On August 28, 1962, Ed tested his submersible decompression chamber off the coast of France. For 8 hours at 60 feet below the surface, Ed himself acted as guinea pig.
And that's what was so wonderful about the guy. This was not an engineer who built things in a laboratory and then let other people use them. He was always the first guy to test them. As he said to me, you know, if you want to build these things and if you're going to design them and build them, you have to have the integrity to go and test them. And I like that about him.
The next day, Robert Stenduit, a world-renowned test diver, spent 26 hours at 200 feet below sea level. It was, up to that time, the longest, deepest dive ever accomplished. For the next 6 months, Ed and his team carried out one groundbreaking experiment after another at depths never before imagined. On April 10, 1964, Sea Diver was anchored in the Mediterranean, preparing for its deepest dive to date, when news came in of a devastating accident. A U.S. nuclear submarine was missing off the coast of New England.
Thresher was the lead ship of its class. There was no finer submarine at that time and no finer crew, all well trained. And it became very apparent during the search that the Navy had built these extraordinary submarines that could travel underwater into this new frontier and could go deeper than there was a rescue capability. So if the Thresher had gone down, for example, in 1,000 feet or 1,200 feet, the crew would have stayed on indefinitely until they'd suffocated.
The country was shocked and angry, and they demanded action. President Kennedy ordered an investigation. As it had 30 years earlier during the airmail crisis, the country once again looked toward the quiet genius from Binghamton.
This group that came together, the Deep Submergent Systems Review Group, of which Ed Link was a critical part, came forward with a number of suggestions about what should be done in terms of developing the capability for search and the capability for salvage. One of the recommendations was that human beings should have the capability of working deep for long periods of time, down to depths of, let's say, 600 feet at least, and that they should have the technical support that goes with that. So there was this great urgency to develop a capability which didn't exist, and that helped Ed Link's Man in Sea program.
Ed surged ahead, diving deeper and staying longer, and inventing as he went. Sea Diver and her crew of researchers were exploring the uncharted depths of the seas, and Ed was having the time of his life.
Marion once told me that she loved adventure and she had to love adventure. That's why she married Ed, and that she had it all the time, because they were always doing something exciting and sometimes a little dangerous.
One night we had a terrible storm over in the Bahamas where we had put the underwater station down for some testing before the deep dive, and a storm blew in and the anchors shifted, and I remember coming out on the deck and seeing a kind of huddle of guys around a coil of rope or something, and in the lightning flashes I could see a couple of guys struggling to get this coil of hoses and wires uncoupled from where it had jammed. One of those guys was Ed Link. He was not standing back and telling people what to do. He was in there, you know, shirt sleeves rolled up, rain and waves pouring over his head, and I remember seeing him afterwards, after it was all over, and he was like a young boy. You know, you could see and feel his strength. Marion was an extraordinary woman because this was an extraordinary guy. This is an exceptional, hard-working, time away from the house kind of guy. And for all of us on the ship, she was the ship mother. I mean, she was there for us, would do anything, had a softness and a gentleness, could be tough, but had that kind of warmth and you know, concern for us that was really nice to have.
And Clayton was involved in much of Ed's work. He was very enthusiastic about diving and was becoming a world-class diver himself.
Very good diver, loved diving. He would just, any excuse, he would get in the water too, and I felt the same way. There was a nice relationship between Clay and Marion and Ed. They were good on the ship together.
On June 4th, 1966, Ed was presented with an honorary degree from Syracuse University. Marion, who had graduated from there 37 years before, became an alumna trustee. "I finally got a college degree," Ed told a friend. "My dad would be proud." 2 days later, Marion and Ed celebrated their 35th wedding anniversary in Binghamton. While there, Ed visited the factory which still bore his name. The small factory that Ed had started 35 years before had grown into a billion-dollar industry and was now the primary simulation resource for training the men who would walk on the moon. But the aviator had moved on to a new frontier and was ready to unveil his latest creation.
The deep diver was the very first working lockout submarine. This was a real stroke of genius, where he looked at what he had learned from the deep dive with the underwater station, decided that mobility was what he really wanted, and built this small submarine, the first of its kind in the world, that would put divers on anywhere on the continental shelf. Now keep in mind, the continental shelf is an area the size of Africa. It's 11.5 million square miles. So we would make a dive, let's say to 400, 500 feet, park the submarine on the bottom, and the divers in the back compartment, in the stern compartment, would pressurize and make a lockout dive. In other words, the hatch would fall open once the pressure inside was equal to the water pressure. The hatch would fall open, and they would actually, we call it locking out, going out into the ocean, do their work, come back in, close the hatch, and then come back to the surface. And of course, it was that capability that got us involved in the search for the Scorpion.
On May 30th, 1968, just 5 years after the Thresher went down, the USS Scorpion disappeared in the deep waters of the Atlantic. An intense, wide-scale search was put into action. Every available resource was called in.
Deep Diver was the only submarine in the world at that time that could go down to 1,000 feet, lock a diver out to go and inspect and look at the Scorpion, and do some work if necessary, and then come back in. So it, again, Ed on this one was way ahead of his time. He just knew that this kind of device was going to be one of the most effective ways to get into the ocean.
The Scorpion was found 5 months later in 12,000 feet of water. Everyone on board was dead. But Link's little yellow submarine had given hope of rescue where none had existed before. In 1970, Link was 65 years old, and the years at sea had begun to take their toll. He ached from arthritis and suffered from diabetes. But he refused to stop. Retirement was unthinkable. "I've never worked a day in my life," he told his friends. "I've just done what I love to do and had fun." During his work with the Deep Submergence Review Group following the Thresher disaster, Ed had met and become friends with Dr. Seward Johnson, executive and heir to the Johnson & Johnson empire. Seward shared Ed's love for the sea and had begun work on developing an institute to promote research of the world's oceans. And Ed had already started to build what Marion described as a submarine of radically different design. He wanted to create a vehicle that would give researchers a view of the sea only dreamed of by writers of science fiction. But Ed was a man who took dreams and made them real. On January 29, 1971, at the newly created Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institute in Florida, Ed and Seward launched the Johnson Sea Link. Marion described it as the first manned diver-carrying small submersible to be made available to scientific institutions strictly for marine research. Nicknamed the Bubble Sub, the Sea Link was equipped with a 4-inch thick acrylic sphere, providing, as Marion called it, a window to the sea. In the rear of the sub was a chamber for carrying divers to depths below 1,500 feet. 40 years before, Edwin Link had changed the world of aviation with his little blue box made of piano parts. Now he had opened the seas for man to explore like never before. But the deep waters that Ed had grown to love and respect were about to deal him a devastating blow. On June 17, 1973, Sea Diver was anchored 15 miles off the coast of Key West, Florida. The Johnson Sea Link was 300 feet below, checking fish traps near a scuttled Navy battleship. Ed and Marion were on deck when a distress call came in from the sub. The Sea Link was trapped in a mesh of cables with 4 men on board, 2 pilots in the front bubble and 2 men in the rear compartment, diver Albert Stover and Clayton Link.
I was in Toronto, and I was working on something else, and I had a phone call. And I was asked if I would go right away, if I would come right away. And so I got on a plane and I flew to Key West, and I got a ride out to the ship. The submarine was still on the bottom at that time. This was a tragedy that stretched over 2 days. And I can remember going in and seeing Ed and Marion and seeing the look on their face as the rescue just didn't happen.
The world watched as one effort after another failed to free the trapped sub. The underwater current was too strong for anyone to penetrate. The man who had spent his life making the skies and seas safer for man to explore could do nothing but wait. When the sub was finally pulled free 32 hours later, Stover and Link were dead. The 2 pilots in front were weak but alive.
I saw the effect that it had on Ed and Marion, and you cannot describe, the loss of a son under those circumstances.
We had prepared and rehearsed and everything so much that we didn't really have any crisis except this one time. And again, I blame myself a lot because we were trying to hurry things up, and we shouldn't have allowed it.
For nearly 2 years, Ed withdrew from his work, spending more time with his grandchildren and working alone in his garage. When he returned to Harbor Branch, he started work on an underwater cable rescue device that could have saved his son. But more and more he seemed to find comfort in the simple joys of his youth. He began rebuilding and installing an old Link theater organ at the Robertson Museum in Binghamton. And at Harbor Branch, he built a railroad museum, complete with a full-scale steam train, and spent time giving rides to kids. On May 30th, 1981, with his wife of 50 years by his side, Ed Link received his 5th honorary degree from the State University at Binghamton. Though battling heart disease and cancer, Link still dreamed of heading out for more adventures with his bride and first mate.
There's this little anniversary card that he made for her, and he had put in it 2 tickets to somewhere. So they were still going to make a final trip. She never knew where, you know, because it didn't say, but that was just shortly before he died.
On September 7th, 1981, Edwin Link died quietly in his sleep at his home in Binghamton. He was 77 years old. He was laid to rest in a simple grave near his son.
When I think of that, I think of that wonderful saying, and that is, to be a real explorer is not just to discover new lands, but is to see with new eyes. And I think that's one of the great legacies of Ed Link. He taught a number of us to kind of look at things with new eyes.
After his death, a friend wrote, "Ed Link was a man who saw the sky reflected in water and altered our perception of both. He was a man who touched a spark in the minds of others, a spark that caused a nation to be proud and men to reach beyond themselves to the stars and into the unknown depths of the sea.